She is holding the note that says she will not live to see spring, and the man everyone warned her about is walking toward her with someone else's blood on his hands. The candle on the side table has been burning too long. It gutters now, throwing her shadow long and crooked against the corridor wall, and she does not move to steady it. She cannot. Her hand is shaking too hard to hold anything but the scrap of paper already crushed inside her fist. The paper that had been slipped beneath her door not 10 minutes before. The paper with 6 words on it she will never be able to unread. She does not live to see spring, that is what it says. Not a threat dressed up in politeness, not a warning wrapped in courtesy, just a fact, stated plainly, the way you might tell someone the weather is turning. And down the hall, in the dark, something is moving. She knows the shape of him, even before the candlelight finds his face. She has learned him in 3 weeks, the way you learn a house you were not born in, by instinct, by the sound of a particular floorboard, by the specific silence he carries into a room before anyone else notices he has entered it. He is fully dressed, though it is well past 2 in the morning. There is a pistol tucked into his belt, and along one knuckle, dark and already drying, there is blood that does not belong to him. She should run. Every story she was ever told about this man, every whispered warning from an aunt, every raised eyebrow from a woman at an assembly, every hushed conversation that stopped the moment she entered a room, every one of those stories has been building toward exactly this moment, toward a corridor at night, toward a man with blood on his hands walking straight for her. She does not run. That is the thing she will turn over in her mind for the rest of her life, longer even than she turns over the note, longer than she turns over the blood. She stands very still in her nightgown, with her back nearly to the wall, and instead of the terror she is supposed to feel, instead of the scream that a sensible woman would already have loosed into the sleeping house, she feels something far more dangerous. She feels curiosity. She feels, God help her, something close to relief that he is the one coming toward her in the dark, and not whoever left that note. She has already begun, without admitting it to herself, to trust the wrong things about the right man. Somewhere below them, in the belly of the sleeping house, a clock she has never once heard before tonight is striking the half-hour, slow and deliberate, as though even time itself has decided to take its measure of this corridor before allowing another minute to pass. She notices the sound the way she notices everything now, filing it away without knowing yet what use it will be. She notices, too, the particular smell of him as he closes the distance between them, wax smoke, cold night air, and underneath both of those, faint and coppery, the blood. She will remember that smell for the rest of her life, long after she has stopped being afraid of what it meant, what she does not know, what she will not know for weeks yet, though it is happening right now, in this exact corridor, in this exact breath of candlelight, is that the blood on his hand does not belong to a threat being carried out. It belongs to a threat being stopped. Somewhere behind him, in a part of the house the servants have learned not to ask questions about, a man who tried to silence someone loyal to her is lying very still and very sorry for it. The danger in this house is not the Duke walking toward her, with his sleeves still damp. The danger is the one he has spent 6 years hunting, and tonight, without meaning to let her see any of it, he has come close enough to catch its scent. The scene that looks, in this exact second, like every legend about him finally coming true, is in fact, the legend quietly coming apart at the seams. But she does not know that yet. All she knows is the candle, and the note, and the blood, and the sound of his boots getting closer on the stone floor, and the strange, treacherous, unshakable fact that some small, foolish part of her is glad he is the one who found her first. He stops perhaps 6 feet from her, close enough now that the candlelight finally reaches his face fully, and for one long moment neither of them says anything at all. The note is still crushed in her hand. His knuckle is still dark and wet in the dim light. And somewhere behind his eyes, in the half-second before he speaks, she thinks she sees something that looks almost like relief, as though he too had been afraid of what he would find at the end of this corridor, and had not expected, of all things, to find her still standing. We'll leave her there a moment, candle guttering, note crushed in her fist, a Duke with someone else's blood drying on his knuckles, walking toward her through the dark, and not one word yet spoken between them. I promise you, it is not what it looks like. I think, if you have been listening closely, you already suspect that. If you're still with me, come a little closer, subscribe, and I will let you sit right beside her for the rest of this. Because what happens next in this corridor is not the ending of her story, it is barely the middle of it. And if you do not subscribe, well, you will owe me a favor by the time this is over, because you are going to want to know exactly how a penniless vicar's daughter ends up, months from now, asleep by a fire in the arms of the most feared man in England, and not the least bit afraid. Let me take you back to where this began. Not in a corridor at midnight, in a parsonage, in Hampshire, in a house that no longer belonged to the woman standing in it. Her name was Eleanor Ashcombe, and on the morning everything changed. She was doing what she did every morning, counting. She was 24 years old, the eldest daughter of the late Reverend Josiah Ashcombe, and for 11 months she had been counting things the way other women her age counted invitations, or suitors, or the days until a wedding. She counted candles. She counted the coal left in the scuttle. She counted, with a particular cold precision she had taught herself out of necessity, exactly how many weeks remained before the men who called themselves her father's creditors stopped being patient. The parsonage kitchen that morning held exactly 4 candles, a half sack of flour that would not last the fortnight, and a fire that had to be coaxed twice before it caught. And Eleanor had noted all 3 facts the moment she rose, the way another woman might have noted the weather or the day of the week. It was not a habit she was proud of. It was simply the shape her mind had taken since her father's death, an accounting that never fully switched itself off, even in sleep. Her father had died the way good men sometimes do, quietly, in his sleep, on an ordinary Tuesday, leaving behind a modest living, 2 younger daughters who still needed dowries they would never have, a widow whose health had been fragile even before the grief arrived, and a small mountain of debts he had never once mentioned aloud, because a vicar does not burden his family with the arithmetic of his own failing finances. Some of those debts were honest. Some belonged to men who circled the parsonage like carrion birds the moment word of his death reached the county, sensing, correctly, that a family of women with no man to speak for them was a family that could be pressed. Eleanor had read every one of her father's letters twice. She had gone through his ledgers by candlelight, long after her mother and sisters were asleep, not because she understood finance, but because understanding it was the only thing left in her power to do. That was the shape of her strength, if you wanted to name it. Not a loud thing, not a thing that wept in public or raged at the unfairness of it. She read, she watched, she remembered everything, filed away like pressed flowers between the pages of a book, and she only ever acted once she had enough information to act correctly. It would be this same quiet discipline, this same refusal to move, before she understood the whole of a situation, that would one day put her in a room with the single piece of evidence that broke a 6-year-old case wide open, but that was still a long way off. On this particular morning, it only meant she knew, to the day, how much longer they had before they lost the parsonage entirely. Every night, regardless of where she found herself, Eleanor kept one small ritual. She would open her father's old sermon notebook, worn soft at the corners from his own thumbs, and copy a single line from it into a small book of her own. It was not devotion exactly, though it looked like it. It was closer to survival. As long as she was still copying his words down in her own hand, some part of her father was still speaking, still present, still telling her what to do next. She did not yet know that this same small habit, the private, unglamorous act of transcribing old words into new pages, would one day place her, quite by accident, in the very room where the truth about her own marriage was waiting to be found. What she wanted, underneath all the practical arithmetic of debts and creditors, was not rescue. She was careful never to let herself want that, because wanting rescue felt like admitting she was as helpless as the gossips already believed her to be. What she wanted, if she was honest with herself in the particular hour before sleep, when honesty could no longer be avoided, was to matter, to be seen as capable, rather than as a problem waiting to be solved by whichever man could be persuaded to take her off her mother's hands. Underneath even that was a smaller, more dangerous hope, one she rarely let herself finish the thought of, that being useful to someone and being loved by someone might not always have to be two separate things. She feared, more than poverty, more than scandal, that she would spend the whole of her life being managed. Managed by circumstance, managed by relatives who meant well and saw her only as an obligation to be discharged. Managed, eventually, by a husband who would speak of her the way one speaks of a solved problem, and never once by a man who had actually chosen her. The word the gossips used, when they thought she could not hear them, was sacrifice. She feared becoming exactly that, not a person, a sacrifice. And so when the offer came, and it came the way lightning comes, sudden and enormous and impossible to argue with, she said yes before she allowed herself to feel anything about it at all. His name was Nathaniel Ashford, His Grace the Duke of Blackthorn, 33 years old, and the offer itself arrived through a solicitor's letter so cold and so formal that it took Eleanor's mother 3 readings to understand it was, in fact, a marriage proposal and not a legal summons. The Duke of Blackthorn required a wife. The Ashcombe family required, urgently and without alternative, the settling of their debts. It was not romantic. It was not meant to be. It was an arrangement, precisely calibrated, and Eleanor understood exactly what she was agreeing to when she agreed to it. Her mother had wept over the letter, not from grief, but from a relief so total it looked, for a moment, indistinguishable from grief. And her younger sisters had gone very quiet when they understood what it meant. The way children go quiet when they sense an adult conversation has turned into something they are not meant to fully understand. What she understood far less well was the man himself, and society was only too eager to fill in the gaps for her. The Duke of Blackthorn, they told her, in whispers behind gloved hands, in letters from aunts who had never met him but felt strongly all the same, had buried 2 wives already. 2. The first had died within a year of her marriage, quietly, at Blackthorn House, in circumstances the family had never fully explained. The second had lasted scarcely longer. Neither death had ever been proven to be anything but misfortune, and neither had ever been proven otherwise either, which was, in the particular arithmetic of gossip, so much worse. A confirmed villain can be avoided. A man merely suspected of villainy, who moves through the world with total unreadable composure, regardless of what is said about him, is a far more unsettling thing to look at. His power was not in question, whatever else was. He held vast estates across 3 counties. He held a seat in the House of Lords he almost never troubled himself to occupy. He held, more than anything, absolute command over the fate of every soul in his household, the kind of power that could end a man's tenancy or ruin a woman's name with a single unhurried sentence. And everyone around him knew it, which was precisely why his refusal to ever defend himself against the rumors unsettled people more than the rumors themselves. He had trained himself, in fact, never to defend himself at all. 2 wives dead. A nation's worth of whispers, and he let every accusation stand, uncontested, because contesting it would have meant admitting the truth he had buried even deeper than the rumors, that someone inside his own household, someone his late father had trusted completely, was a killer, and that naming that danger aloud, years ago, had very nearly gotten a 3rd woman killed before he learned the harder lesson of hiding the hunt instead of announcing it. He had spent 6 years, quietly and alone, hunting his father's former steward, the true architect of a forged inheritance scheme that had already cost 2 women their lives, and he had let the entire world brand him a murderer rather than risk exposing the man who actually was one. A suspected duke draws less suspicion and does far less damage to an investigation than a duke who stands up in society and publicly accuses a member of his own late father's inner circle. So he said nothing. He let them call him what they wished, and underneath the silence, week after week, year after year, he kept looking. Eleanor did not know any of this on the day she first laid eyes on him. She knew only what everyone knew, that he was the duke no bride was expected to survive, and she met him, for the very first time, presiding over her own wedding to him, with a composure so total, so unreadable, that it took her breath away more thoroughly than any tenderness could have. Behind gloved hands, all around the small chapel, wedding guests were placing wagers, in whispers just loud enough to carry to the altar, just loud enough for the bride to hear every word, on how many weeks the new duchess would survive. Eleanor stood at that altar in a gown that had been let out twice to fit her mother's old measurements, holding the hand of a man the whole of England believed had killed twice already, and she did not cry, and she did not faint, and she did not run. She had already decided, long before she arrived at that altar, that whatever else this marriage cost her, it would not cost her the last of her dignity. What she had not yet decided, what no one could have told her, standing there in her mother's remade gown with the whole county placing bets on her death, was that the man beside her was not the danger the county believed him to be. That discovery was still to come, and it would take everything she had. The wedding breakfast was the first time bride and groom exchanged more than the vows themselves. It was not a large gathering. A handful of Eleanor's relatives had made the long journey from Hampshire, and most of them left again before dark, murmuring excuses about the roads that fooled no one. Nathaniel's household staff moved through the rooms with the practiced silence of people who have learned not to be seen reacting to anything. And at the edges of every room, close enough to overhear, but never close enough to be caught listening, hovered the estate steward, a Mr. Croft, whose attentiveness Eleanor would only understand, much later, to have been something closer to surveillance than service. Presiding over the whole affair like a carved figure of disapproval was the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, whose expression did not shift once the entire day, not even when the toasts began. Eleanor noticed the toasts more than anything else. She noticed, specifically, that when Nathaniel took her hand to raise their glasses together, she did not flinch. Every other person in that room, she realized afterward, had flinched in some small way at some point that day, a relative's hand trembling as they offered congratulations, a servant's eyes dropping too quickly when the Duke passed. She alone had not flinched, and she watched something shift behind his eyes when he noticed it too. It was, she would learn eventually, the first thing about her he could not stop thinking about for the rest of that long, strange day. What she noticed about him, in turn, cost her something she had not expected to lose. She noticed that every time the door to the breakfast room opened, a servant bringing in another dish, a late guest arriving, nothing more sinister than that, his eyes went to it immediately and stayed there a beat too long. It was not the look of a man searching a room for someone he hoped to see. It was the look of a man standing guard. She understood, watching him do this for the 5th time, then the 6th, that whatever he was watching for at that door, he expected it to be bad. Noticing that cost her the comfortable version of her own fear. It would have been so much easier, she thought later, lying awake in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar house, to simply believe the rumors and marry a monster. A monster asks nothing further of you. A monster is finished, entirely, the moment you have named him one. But a man standing watch at his own wedding breakfast, guarding a door against something he refused to name, that man asked everything of her. That man made her wonder, against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed, what exactly he was protecting her from, and why he would not simply say. The power between them, in every polite exchange that day, sat exactly where the law had placed it, and nowhere else. He could end this marriage with a word, and with it, every debt relieved, every promise of security her family had been given. She had no recourse if he did. She had nowhere else to go, no other family who could take in a bride returned as damaged goods, and both of them understood this perfectly well, even as they smiled for the relatives who had stayed to watch them eat. It was somewhere in the middle of that long, careful afternoon that the first note appeared. No one admitted to placing it. It was simply there, tucked beneath the stem of Eleanor's wine glass, folded once, when she reached for her drink during the second round of toasts. She had it open and half read. 4 words, she would remember later. Only 4, though she would not tell anyone for some time exactly which 4, before Nathaniel saw it too. Ask him about the first one. For one unguarded second, one single, terrible second that Eleanor would replay for weeks afterward, turning it over and over like a coin she could not decide the value of. The composed, unreadable, watchful Duke she had married that morning looked, unmistakably, afraid. Then it was gone. His face resumed its careful stillness. He said something light and forgettable to the relative seated beside him, and the breakfast continued as though nothing at all had happened, and Eleanor sat with the folded note in her lap and understood, with a clarity that made her hands go cold, that whatever she had married into, it was not simply a man with an unfortunate reputation. It was something much closer to her, and much less finished than she had been told. That night, their wedding night, in a house she had lived in for less than a day, a second note found its way inside her own locked bedchamber. She had checked the lock herself before retiring, out of an old habit her father had taught her without ever explaining why, and it had been secure. And yet there the note was in the morning light, seeping under the door before dawn, slid across the floor by a hand she had neither seen nor heard, proof that whoever was doing this either possessed a key to her private rooms or had an accomplice inside the house who did. The realization landed in her chest like a stone dropped down a well, the sound of it arriving long after the drop itself. This was no longer society's gossip reaching her from a safe distance, no longer a rumor she could set down and walk away from. This was inside her walls, inside the one room in the entire house she had believed, however foolishly, still belonged only to her. Whatever had happened to the two women who had worn her title before her, if anything truly had, it had direct, unlocked, uncontested access to her now. What Nathaniel did in response told her more than any words could have. He did not dismiss the note. He did not offer easy reassurance, the kind a man says simply to end a difficult conversation. Instead, he had a chair carried from a nearby room and set outside her bedchamber door, and he sat in it, fully dressed, for the entire night, and did not once go to bed himself. Eleanor woke twice before dawn and heard, both times, the particular creak of that chair shifting under a man's weight, a sound too specific, too practiced, too immediately familiar to him to have been the first time he had ever done such a thing. It told her, without a single word of confession passing between them, that he had guarded a door like this before, and that whatever he had been guarding against, the last time, he had lost. She lay awake with that knowledge settling over her like a second blanket, and by morning she understood she had a decision to make, and no one to make it for her. She could demand to leave, return to Hampshire, forfeit whatever security this marriage had bought her family, and let the debts do what debts do. Or she could stay and find out, quietly, on her own terms, precisely what was happening inside this house before it happened to her. She chose to stay. She told herself it was for her mother and her sisters. She did not yet let herself examine the other reason. It was in the days that followed, searching the estate library for anything at all that might explain the notes, that Eleanor found the ledger. She had not been looking for it specifically. She had been looking for old correspondence, old newspapers, anything that might tell her what had truly happened to the two women who came before her, and in the course of that search she found, tucked behind ordinary household accounts that Mrs. Pemberton kept on behalf of the steward, a private ledger recording payments that had never once appeared in any of the estate's public books. For years, the dates went back further than Eleanor could account for at first glance. Nathaniel had been quietly sending an allowance to the surviving relatives of both his late wives. Not a single payment made out of guilt in the immediate aftermath of a death. Years of it. Drawn entirely from his own personal accounts, never from the estate's finances, and never once mentioned by him to a single soul, not even, it seemed, to the families receiving it under whatever name he had used to disguise the sender. Eleanor sat with that ledger open on her lap for a long time before she could make herself close it. A guilty man does not do this. A guilty man silences the families of the women he has wronged or ignores them entirely, hoping the whole matter simply fades from memory. He does not fund them, secretly, for years, at his own expense, asking nothing in return, and taking every precaution to ensure he is never thanked for it. Every rumor Eleanor had accepted at face value since the day the proposal arrived cracked a little under the weight of that single discovery, and she found she could no longer hold on to the comfortable belief she had been carrying, that he was simply innocent, or simply dangerous, whichever was easier to decide and be done with. She knew now that he was hiding something, deliberately, at real and ongoing cost to himself, and that whatever that something was, it was not cruelty. It did not look like cruelty. It looked, if she was honest, like penance. She learned only later, far too late to have used the knowledge sooner, that he had routed every one of those payments through his own solicitor under a false name for precisely this reason, so that no one, least of all a new bride, with sharp eyes and a habit of reading things she was never meant to see, could ever trace the money back to him and ask the question he had spent 6 years avoiding. If she had been paying closer attention, she might have connected it sooner to the fear she had seen cross his face at the wedding breakfast, or to the particular, practiced way he had guarded her door that first night. But she was not yet ready to see the whole shape of what she was looking at. She only knew, closing that ledger and returning it exactly to where she had found it, that her husband was not what the county believed him to be, and that finding out what he actually was might cost her more than she was prepared to lose. The danger, in the meantime, did not wait politely for her to catch up. At a neighboring assembly some weeks later, in a crowded room full of candlelight and careful conversation, a guest, emboldened by wine and by the particular cruelty that thrives in company, raised a glass and proposed, loudly enough for the entire room to hear, a toast to the new Duchess. "May she last the season," he said, and laughed, and for one horrible suspended moment the whole room laughed with him, before the laughter collapsed into mortified silence, when everyone remembered, all at once, that she was standing right there. Eleanor did not weep. She stood very still, the way she had taught herself to stand when a thing happening was too large to respond to all at once, and she let the silence in the room finish the sentence the drunk guest had started, because there was nothing she could say that would not simply confirm every fear the whole county already held about her marriage. It was on the return journey from that same assembly, in driving rain, that the carriage's axle failed on a narrow bridge, and the world tipped sideways all at once. Eleanor remembered very little of the accident itself with any clarity. The scream of the horses, the terrible lurch as the wheels lost the road, the impossible sense of the whole carriage turning over in the dark. What she remembered, with absolute and permanent clarity, was the weight of him. Nathaniel had thrown himself across her the instant the carriage began to tip, and had taken, without hesitation, the worst of what followed onto his own body rather than hers. When the carriage finally came to rest, broken and half in the ditch, it was his blood she found on her hands first, not her own. She should have felt only gratitude. For a while, in the confusion of the aftermath, that was all she did feel. But recovering from the accident, exhausted himself, frightened for her in a way he clearly had neither the words nor the practice to express, Nathaniel did something that undid, in a single afternoon, some measure of the trust the ledger had so carefully built. He ordered her confined to her rooms, for her own protection, he said, without once asking her opinion of the matter, without once explaining what precisely she needed protecting from, simply issuing the order the way a man issues orders to people who have no standing to refuse them. For the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor did not see a mystery standing in front of her. She saw a man who, however frightened, however well-intentioned, had decided without consulting her that her own judgment did not matter as much as his authority. It wounded her exactly where her deepest fear had always predicted a husband would eventually wound her, in the quiet, humiliating certainty that she would spend her whole life being managed rather than chosen, however kindly the managing was dressed up. She did not confront him about it. She went to her rooms as ordered, and that night, alone, she took up pen and paper and began a letter to her mother that she was not certain, even as she wrote it, she would ever send. In it, she asked her mother a question she was almost too ashamed to put into words: whether it might not in fact be safer, and in its own quiet way more bearable, to simply endure a distant, silent marriage from here forward, to stop asking questions entirely, to become precisely the compliant, unseen wife that society had expected of her from the very beginning, rather than continue risking everything, her safety, her composure, and worst of all, the feelings she could no longer entirely deny, she had begun to hold, for a man who might, for all she truly knew, still be lying to her, about the thing that mattered most. She did not finish the letter that night. She would not finish it for several nights more, but she folded what she had written and put it away in the same small book where she kept her father's sermon lines, and she lay awake a long time in the dark, listening for the creak of a chair outside her door, and finding, that night, only silence. It was her father, in the end, who told her the truth, though he had been dead for nearly a year when he did it. Eleanor had continued her private study of his old papers in whatever spare hour the days allowed her, partly out of habit, and partly because it was the only task left in this house that still felt entirely, safely her own. It was in the course of that quiet, unglamorous work, the same discipline that had once let her track a family's debts to the week, that she found a letter tucked among her father's old correspondence, a letter that had nothing to do with sermons or parish business at all. Decades earlier, before Eleanor was even born, her father had once been called upon to witness an estate transaction for the Blackthorn family. It was the kind of small, forgettable service a country clergyman was sometimes asked to provide, and he had noted it, briefly, in a private letter to an old friend, along with one careful, precise detail that meant nothing to him at the time, and everything now. He named, plainly and without knowing what he was naming, a signature on that transaction that did not match the hand it claimed to belong to. He named it as Croft's forgery. Eleanor sat with that letter for a long time, feeling something cold and enormous settle into place behind her ribs. She had been carrying, without knowing it, the final piece of evidence in a 6-year-old case since before she had ever set foot inside Blackthorn House. Her own father, gone now, unable to explain, unable to warn her, had witnessed the very fraud that had shaped the whole of her husband's silence, years before either of them had any reason to imagine their lives would ever be tangled together. She understood, reading it a second time and then a third, precisely what it meant. Steward Croft, the same man who had hovered at her wedding breakfast with an attentiveness she had once mistaken for mere diligence, the same man whose ledgers she had searched through in the library, the same man with access to every lock and every ledger in this entire house, was the true architect of an old inheritance fraud from Nathaniel's father's era. And both women who had held her title before her had died after independently discovering fragments of that same scheme. Nathaniel had spent 6 years protecting the world from a killer by letting the world believe he was one. It reframed everything, all at once, the way a single missing word can suddenly make sense of an entire page. Croft's constant hovering at the wedding breakfast, Croft's careful presence in every room where papers and ledgers were kept, Nathaniel's guarding of her door that very first night, too practiced, too specific to have been his first time doing it. Every fragment Eleanor had gathered without understanding, all these weeks, had been quietly pointing not toward a danger inside her husband, but toward a danger inside his house, wearing a servant's coat and calling itself loyalty. She had, sitting there with her father's letter trembling slightly in her hands, exactly one decision left to make. She could carry this evidence straight to Nathaniel, trusting him completely, at last, with the single piece of proof that could finally clear his name and end the danger to her own life once and for all. Or she could protect herself, say nothing, and keep the letter hidden the way she had learned, painfully, to keep so many things hidden these past weeks. We should pause here, just for a moment, because I want to ask you something before we go on. Have you ever held a piece of the truth in your hands and felt, for one single heartbeat, more afraid of what it would cost you to speak it than of what it would cost you to stay silent? That is exactly where Eleanor was standing, and I think, before I tell you what she chose, you already know her well enough to guess. She did not stay silent for long, but before she could carry that letter to Nathaniel, Croft learned that she had found it. She never discovered exactly how. Perhaps a servant loyal to him had seen her in the library. Perhaps he had simply watched her closely enough, for long enough, to recognize the particular stillness of a woman who has just understood something she cannot unknow. However it happened, he came for her that same night, in the abandoned west wing of the house where no one had reason to go after dark, and he believed, walking toward her through rooms draped in dust sheets and old silence, that he could silence her the same way he had silenced 2 duchesses before her. I want you to sit with me in this room for a while, because it deserves to be given its full weight, and I am not going to rush it. The West Wing is cold in a way the rest of Blackthorn House is not. The fire's long since let go out in rooms no one uses, and Eleanor stands very still in the doorway of what was once, she will learn later, a nursery. Croft is between her and the only way out. He is not shouting. That is the detail that frightens her more than shouting would have. He speaks to her, in the same mild, attentive voice he has used at every dinner she has sat through since her wedding day, as though what he intends to do to her tonight is simply one more piece of estate business to be handled quietly and without fuss. She does not scream. She has already decided, somewhere on the walk down that cold corridor, with the letter folded against her chest, that screaming will not save her, and that the only thing she has left that might is the truth itself, spoken plainly, in front of as many witnesses as she can manage to gather. Nathaniel arrives before Croft can finish whatever sentence he has begun. She hears his boots on the stone floor of the corridor, hears the particular quality of urgency in a stride she has learned, these past weeks, to recognize as entirely his own. And it would be easy, so easy, to let this be the moment where the Duke simply arrives and saves her, where his presence alone ends the danger, and she is permitted, finally, to be afraid out loud. But she is the one who speaks first. She holds the letter that could hang him, and she looks at the man everyone warned her about. Not Croft, not any longer, but Nathaniel, standing in the doorway with his chest heaving, and his hand already moving toward the pistol at his belt. And she says the truest thing she has said since the day she arrived at Blackthorn House. "I am not afraid of you," she tells him. "I never was. I was only ever afraid you would let this house kill me before I got the chance to choose you myself." The words hang in that cold room longer than any sound should be able to hang in the air. Croft, for one unguarded second, looks between them both as though he has just understood he has already lost, though the letter has not yet been read aloud, though nothing has yet been proven in front of anyone with the authority to act on it. Eleanor does not wait for Nathaniel to reach for her, or for the letter. She steps between the two men, deliberately, and she holds the evidence out, not to her husband, though he is the one it will save, but to the room itself, to Mrs. Pemberton and two footmen, who have followed the commotion down the corridor, and now stand frozen in the doorway behind Croft, their faces caught somewhere between horror and understanding. She holds it out to all of them, so that no single person in this house, not Croft, not even Nathaniel himself, can ever again silence what has now been seen by more than one pair of eyes. It is only then, with the letter finally out of his reach and out of his control, that Nathaniel moves. He does not go for Eleanor first, and he does not go for the evidence. He turns instead to Croft, and he says, evenly, in a voice Eleanor has never once heard him use, the sentence he has swallowed whole for 6 years, since the night his first wife died, and he first understood exactly what kind of man he had inherited alongside his father's estate. "You are not going to hurt anyone else in my name again." For 6 years, he let the world call him a murderer, to keep her kind of courage from ever needing to exist. Tonight, she needed it anyway, and she was braver than the reputation he had built, at such enormous cost to himself, entirely to protect her from ever having to be. Croft is restrained before dawn, handed over to the local magistrate with the letter and the ledger both laid out as proof no one in the county can any longer dismiss as rumor. But it is Nathaniel who is changed most visibly by what follows. He is forced, for the first time in 6 years, to say aloud, to his own household first, and then formally, before the magistrate himself, everything he has concealed since the day he first understood what Croft had done, and what Croft was willing to do again to keep it hidden. The silence that had been his only form of control over his own story is stripped away, piece by piece, in front of people who have spent 6 years believing the very worst of him. Eleanor's position in that house shifts as visibly as his does, though in the opposite direction. She is no longer the fragile new bride the servants once watched with wary pity, waiting to see how long she would last. She is the woman whose composure and whose evidence ended a threat that had haunted this house for 6 years, and Mrs. Pemberton, who had suspected fragments of the truth for far longer than she ever let herself admit, and stayed loyally silent out of a fear of her own, looks at Eleanor now with something that has quietly, permanently, become loyalty in its own right. What proves Nathaniel has truly changed is not the arrest, and not even the confession. It is what he does after both are finished. Rather than settle the matter quietly, as 6 years of careful silence would have taught any other man to do, he sits down himself and writes, unprompted, to the families of both his late wives, the very families he has been secretly supporting all this time, and tells them, at last, the full truth of what happened to the women they loved. He does it knowing it will cost him. He does it because they have waited long enough, and because Eleanor, more than anyone, has taught him these past weeks that a truth kept out of kindness is still, in the end, a truth kept from someone who deserves it. He requests, too, a formal hearing before the local magistracy, rather than the quiet private settlement his solicitor urges on him twice. He does this deliberately, and he tells Eleanor exactly why when she asks him. Her safety, and whatever future the two of them might yet build together, requires the legend to be dismantled where the whole county can see it happen, not tucked away where it would only ever be convenient for him. Eleanor's family's debts, every last one of them, were settled from the Blackthorn estate within the month, and her mother and her sisters were given the choosing of a home of their own for the first time since her father's death, rather than the mere charity of wherever a relative could spare a room. Eleanor herself was no longer spoken of, in drawing rooms or at assemblies, as the pitied bride nobody expected to survive the season. She was spoken of, when she was spoken of at all now, as the acknowledged Duchess of Blackthorn, whose intelligence and nerve had solved a mystery 6 years in the making. For the first time in the whole of this story, she was safe, and she had not had to disappear into anyone else's shadow to become so. Nathaniel's name was cleared formally, before the whole of London society, at a gathering convened specifically to lay out Croft's confession and the evidence that had ended it. He lost, in that single evening, the isolating armor his terrible reputation had given him for 6 years. What he gained in its place, for the first time since his own father's death, was a household and a wife who knew the entire truth of him now and had chosen to stay regardless. Croft was tried and convicted on the strength of the ledger Eleanor had found and the letter her father had unknowingly left behind for her. Mrs. Pemberton, finally told everything she had spent years only half suspecting, became, in time, the closest thing to family that Eleanor had within the walls of that house. The 2 footmen who had followed the commotion into the West Wing that night were given, at Nathaniel's own insistence, a formal place in the household's confidence rather than a warning to keep silent. A small thing, perhaps, but the first sign to the rest of the staff that secrecy, in this house, would no longer be the price of loyalty. Even the parsonage back in Hampshire found new life. Eleanor's mother chose, in the end, a cottage near the sea her husband had once mentioned wanting to show her, and Eleanor's sisters, for the first time in their lives, were permitted to want things for themselves rather than simply for the family's survival. It is, in the end, a quietly triumphant kind of ending, and I think that is exactly as it should be. This was never a story about a woman waiting to be rescued. It was a story about a woman who investigated her own way into being trusted, whose composure and whose patience turned out to be a kind of courage all on their own, and whose romance, when it finally arrived, was the reward for that courage, rather than any substitute for it. By the fire, in the very same corridor where the legend once made her too afraid to sleep, Eleanor drifts off now against Nathaniel's chest, not from the exhaustion of fear this time, from the particular, hard-won safety of finally being known completely and choosing, with the whole truth in front of her, to stay anyway. He stays awake watching over her, as he always has, every night since the first one. But for the first time in 6 years, there is nothing left in that house for him to guard against. They called him the Duke no bride would survive. They were half right. The woman who married him did not survive as the frightened girl who first arrived at his door. She became someone braver than that girl ever imagined she could be, and it was her courage, not his title and not his fortune, that finally set them both free. If you came here tonight hoping for a villain who turns out to be a hero, I hope you found him. And if you came hoping for a woman who saves herself before anyone else ever gets the chance to, I hope, just as much, that you found her too. Because that is the story I keep telling you, over and over, in different houses, with different names, and I do not think I will ever tire of it. If this one found its way to you, and it stayed with you even a little after the fire burned down, then stay with me too. Subscribe, so that I know to save you a seat next time. And if you do not, you owe me a favor, because somewhere out there, another feared Duke is waiting for someone brave enough to fall asleep in his arms. She is asleep now, by the fire, in the arms of the man they once said would be the end of her. He is still awake, still watching over her, not because she is in any danger anymore, but because some habits, once born of fear, become, in the end, simply how you love someone.